Elon Musk confronts racist manager at a cafe. What follows is unbelievable. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the bustling street outside the small outdoor cafe. Its tables were lined up neatly, facing the sidewalk, a cozy corner of the city known for its quiet charm. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the occasional waft of street food, and the chatter of people filled the air. But beneath the casual atmosphere of the cafe, something was brewing that would soon shatter the peaceful calm of the evening. Elon Musk sat at a corner table, a laptop open in front of him, though he seemed distracted. He glanced up every few seconds, his mind clearly elsewhere. The scene around him, a busy cafe with patrons enjoying their evening drinks, felt oddly at odds with the weight of the thoughts running through his mind. He wasn't one for idle time, and yet, here he was, caught in the middle of an afternoon pause. The emails on his laptop screen held no appeal right now. He wiped a hand across his face, trying to shake off the fatigue that had been creeping in for days. It had been a long week of meetings, strategy calls, and endless decisions. This cafe was a rare escape, offering a small slice of normalcy amid the chaos. But his respite was interrupted when he overheard a heated conversation between a white man in a manager's uniform and a young woman sitting at the table next to him. First, it was easy to ignore. The words were indistinct, carried away by the buzz of the street, until a harsh tone cut through the background noise. "You shouldn't be sitting here. This is for paying customers." The manager's voice was snide, his words dripping with a dismissive attitude. Elon glanced up, his brow furrowing. The woman, a young black woman, was clearly taken aback by the comment. She glanced around, unsure if the words were meant for her. "I'm sorry," she replied, confusion lacing her voice. "You heard me," the manager sneered, his arms crossed. "This is a private cafe, and if you're not going to buy anything, then you need to leave." Elon's eyes narrowed. The cafe was public, open to anyone. The manager's words were clearly more about something deeper than the simple transaction of money. Elon's gaze shifted between the manager and the woman, noting the way she looked uncomfortable but hadn't backed down. She sat up straighter, clearly not willing to be intimidated. "Is there a problem here?" Elon asked, his voice calm but firm, as he stood up and approached the table. The manager turned, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected interruption. Elon's presence was magnetic, and the manager's smug demeanor faltered for just a second. "Nothing for you to worry about, sir," the manager replied dismissively, attempting to brush off the situation. "Just some people who think they can take up space without paying for it." Elon's expression remained neutral, but his mind was already processing. He took a moment to look the manager over, tall in his mid-40s, wearing a cafe apron that seemed to hang too loosely on his frame. The look in his eyes, though, said it all. There was a deep-rooted arrogance there, something far more troubling than a simple dispute over seating. The woman, sensing the growing tension, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Elon's gaze turned back to her, silently asking if she was all right. She offered a weak, almost reluctant smile, but her eyes betrayed the anxiety that still gripped her. There was fear, not only from the confrontation but from the knowledge that her race had played a role in this exchange. "Look, it's not about the money," Elon said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's about respect. This isn't your cafe to run like a private club." The manager scoffed, clearly unwilling to let go of his stance. "I don't take advice from random customers," he shot back, his voice dripping with disdain. Elon leaned forward slightly, his gaze unflinching. "Well, then maybe you should," he said, his words measured. "You're not in a position to dictate who belongs here and who doesn't." A few other patrons had started to notice the interaction, their eyes darting between Elon, the manager, and the woman. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, and Elon could feel the weight of their gazes. People were waiting for something, waiting for the explosion that seemed inevitable now. The manager stepped closer to Elon, chest puffed out. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, voice rising. Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, maintaining eye contact. The manager was used to intimidating people. He'd seen it work in his line of work countless times. But there was something different about Elon Musk. His posture was relaxed, but his presence was undeniable. He had a way of making people feel smaller without saying a word. "I don't think you understand," Elon said quietly, leaning in slightly, his voice a whisper now but carrying an undeniable edge. "You may think you're in control here, but you're not. Not anymore." The manager's face twisted with a mix of confusion and frustration. "What is that supposed to mean?" He spat, clearly losing patience. Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over at the woman. Her expression had softened, but her hands were still clenched around the arms of her chair. She wasn't backing down. She was waiting for the moment when this would come to a head. Elon could sense that the real fight wasn't just about the cafe. It was about something much deeper, something the manager was too blind to see. He turned back to the manager. "It means that I'm not going to let you treat her like this. Or anyone else, for that matter." His words were steady, clear. "You're going to apologize, and then you're going to step down." The manager's face reddened, his chest puffing out as if he were about to yell. But before he could open his mouth, something shifted. The woman stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the pavement. "I've had enough," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not going to take this. Not anymore." The manager's eyes flicked to her for a moment, momentarily taken aback by her sudden surge of confidence. He wasn't prepared for her strength, her refusal to submit. He had expected to push her into submission, to make her feel small, insignificant. But he had underestimated both her and Elon Musk. Elon watched as the woman stood her ground, her posture more defiant now, challenging the manager without uttering another word. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she would finally reclaim her dignity. The manager, on the other hand, was clearly taken aback, his expression shifting between disbelief and anger. His initial confidence had begun to crack, but he wasn't about to back down now. Not in front of the crowd that had started to gather, whispering amongst themselves, curious to see where this confrontation would lead. "You're making a mistake," the manager spat, his face flushed with frustration. "You think you can just come here and make demands like you own the place?" Elon didn't respond immediately, letting the words hang in the air. The manager was still standing too close, his body tense, his fists clenched at his sides. But Elon, even without raising his voice, carried an intensity that seemed to make the space around him shrink. It was as if the air was thick with the expectation of something that would shatter the quiet facade the manager had carefully built around himself. "You really think this is how things work, don't you?" Elon finally spoke, his voice cold but measured, as though he were addressing a child who had been misbehaving. "That you can make someone feel small because you think you have power over them. But you're wrong." The manager's jaw tightened. He was losing control, the power dynamic shifting slowly but surely. He had relied on his status, the unspoken authority that came with being the manager of a cafe. He'd been accustomed to people like the woman, who would shrink away in the face of confrontation. But this wasn't working out how he had imagined. His hand clenched into a fist, the nails digging into his palm as his temper flared. "I'm not going to take this," the manager growled, taking a step forward. "You don't know who you're dealing with, and you sure as hell don't have the right to tell me how to run my business." Elon didn't flinch. He stood still, his gaze unwavering, eyes locked onto the manager with an unspoken resolve. "You don't know me either," Elon replied softly, almost too calmly, considering the rising tension. "But I know exactly how you work." The manager hesitated, caught off guard by Elon's cool demeanor. There was something unnerving about how composed he was. Elon wasn't backing down. In fact, it seemed like he was challenging the manager to escalate, to make the next move. The woman beside him had stopped speaking, her eyes darting between Elon and the manager, unsure of what would happen next. The murmurs from the crowd had quieted, everyone watching intently, knowing that the outcome of this moment could tip in one direction or another. Elon wasn't about to let this man get away with his cruelty. He had seen it too many times before, The way people who felt they were in positions of power could treat others with such disregard, with such venomous entitlement. It didn't matter that the manager was just a cafe employee. This was about something deeper. It was about recognizing the subtle ways in which people used their authority to dominate and degrade. You think because you wear that apron and stand behind the counter, you're somehow superior? Elon's words rang out, cutting through the air. His tone was unwavering, confident in a way that sent a chill through the manager. This isn't a game of who has the bigger ego. This is about people, about respect. Something you clearly don't understand. The manager's face contorted with rage, his fists unclenching and clenching again as he looked around, seeking support from the few patrons still seated nearby. The tables closest to the scene had emptied, people unsure of where to stand. They were watching, yes, but no one seemed brave enough to intervene. And then the woman, her voice firm but trembling with pent-up emotion, spoke again. "I'm not going anywhere. I paid for my right to sit here just like everyone else," she said, her eyes never leaving the manager's face. Her defiance was palpable now, and she was no longer just standing her ground. She was demanding to be treated with respect. The manager, flustered and on the verge of losing control, let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think you're going to intimidate me? Just because some rich guy shows up and decides to play hero?" He gestured toward Elon with a dismissive wave, but his words didn't have the same sting they once did. There was something about Elon's composure that was making him second-guess his own position. "Intimidate you?" Elon repeated, his lips curling into the slightest of smirks. "I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here to make sure that you don't get away with treating people like dirt." The crowd had grown larger, a few more curious onlookers edging closer to witness the showdown. Some watched in disbelief, unsure whether to step forward or stay back. The manager's temper had reached a boiling point, and it was only a matter of time before he snapped. Elon, however, remained unshaken, his posture still relaxed, his focus unbroken. "You're not going to do anything," the manager hissed, his voice growing louder, drawing even more attention. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Elon said quietly. "I know exactly what you're about, and it's not about running a cafe. It's about exerting power over people who don't have the privilege you do." The words seemed to hit the manager harder than any physical blow could have. He took a half step back, momentarily lost for words, but quickly regained his posture. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he snapped. Elon, unperturbed, finally took a step forward. The move was subtle, but it was enough to make the manager falter. Elon's eyes never left his, unwavering. "I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you that this is a public space, and no one, especially you, has the right to treat someone like this." The manager's face was a mixture of rage and confusion. He couldn't understand why things weren't going the way he had planned. He had been the one in control, but with every word Elon spoke, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. Elon wasn't just the customer here. He was something far more powerful. The manager's grip on the situation was slipping fast. The manager's knuckles were turning white as he clenched his fists harder, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He had miscalculated, hadn't expected this kind of resistance, not from someone like Elon Musk, who seemed to stand firm in a way that unsettled him. The more he tried to assert his dominance, the more it slipped away. Elon wasn't intimidated by his aggression. Instead, he seemed to feed off it, his eyes steely, unwavering. "Who do you think you are? Huh?" The manager growled, voice laced with venom. He stepped forward again, chest puffed up, but this time, something in his expression betrayed his uncertainty. His posture was rigid, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had expected to command respect with his uniform, with his position behind the counter, but the air had shifted. Elon met the manager's aggression with the same cold composure. He didn't step back or flinch. He just stood his ground. "I'm a person who believes in fairness," Elon said, his voice firm, but calm, like he was teaching a child the right way to behave. "And right now, what you're doing isn't fair. You're bullying someone because you think you can. You're trying to impose a rule that doesn't exist, just so you can feel in control. The words cut through the thickening tension in the air. The manager's face reddened, his jaw tightening. He was caught, cornered by the truth, unable to escape the reality of his actions. But he refused to back down. He couldn't afford to. His sense of power was all he had in this moment. "I don't need you telling me what's right or wrong," the manager barked, now fully glaring at Elon, his voice escalating. "This is my cafe, and I'll decide who gets to sit here. You think you can just waltz in and play hero? This isn't a game." Elon's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the break in the manager's resolve. The more the manager pushed, the more his own insecurities showed. He was floundering, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping from his grasp. But Elon knew better than to allow the manager to shift the narrative. "No, it's not a game," Elon said, his voice now colder, each word precise and cutting. "But you're treating it like one. Like people are disposable, like they don't matter. And that's where you're wrong." The manager's nostrils flared as his breath quickened. He wasn't ready for this kind of confrontation. He had hoped for a simple exchange, a minor scuffle that would go unnoticed. But now, he was locked in a war of words with someone who wasn't afraid to challenge his authority. Behind Elon, the young woman's eyes were glued to the exchange, her hands now resting on the table as she gathered the strength to push through the growing tension. She had gone quiet, but her body language told a different story. She was watching, absorbing every word, every move. There was a silent understanding between her and Elon. He wasn't just confronting the manager for her sake. He was confronting the deep-rooted injustice that had been allowed to fester in this small corner of the city. "You don't belong here," the manager spat, a final attempt at regaining his ground. His voice was shaking now, but he was still trying to control the situation. "You don't even belong in this town." Elon raised an eyebrow, his lips curling ever so slightly into a smirk. The comment didn't land the way the manager intended. If anything, it further exposed his weakness. Elon stepped closer, his tone quiet but cutting, the weight of his words unmistakable. "People like you always try to create boundaries," Elon said. "You create lines in the sand, expecting everyone to stay in their place. But the truth is, no one belongs more than anyone else. Not you, not me, not her." The crowd surrounding them had only grown, whispers now spreading through the small cafe as onlookers strained to hear every word. Their eyes darted between the two men, sensing that something was about to break wide open. Some began to shift nervously, uncertain of what would happen next, but no one stepped forward. The manager looked around, his expression shifting between outrage and fear. For the first time since the confrontation started, he looked uncertain, his sense of control dissipating like smoke. He was losing this battle, and everyone could see it. His face twitched with fury, his body language betraying a desperate attempt to salvage his pride. "Get out of my face," the manager snapped, stepping back and raising his hand, as if to physically push Elon away. But there was no confidence in his movement, just a raw, desperate energy, as if he were reaching for something to hold on to. Elon stood his ground. He wasn't fazed by the manager's attempts to intimidate him further. He knew that this wasn't about physical confrontation, it was about respect, about showing that power could come from standing firm in your beliefs, not in the ability to bully others. "You don't get to tell me to leave," Elon said, his voice steady, his eyes piercing through the manager. "Not here. Not now." The woman, still standing nearby, let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might break. She had been waiting for this moment, watching, hoping that someone would finally stand up to the injustice. And now, here was Elon Musk doing exactly that, standing up not only for her but for the countless others who had been made to feel small by people like this manager. For the first time, the manager seemed to hesitate, his anger momentarily replaced by fear. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He had been outmaneuvered. His arrogance was no match for Elon's calm, collected demeanor. But instead of retreating, he dug in his heels, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You think you can just show up and tell me how to do my job?" The manager sneered, his voice rising once more. I don't think you know who you're messing with. Elon's eyes remained locked on the manager, never wavering. You're right. I don't know you. But I do know this, you're not the one in charge here. Not anymore. The manager's face turned a deep shade of red, his fists clenching again. But his resolve had already started to crumble. He was no longer the imposing figure he once seemed. Elon had reduced him to nothing more than a man desperately clinging to a lost cause. The weight of his own actions was beginning to sink in, and it wasn't the confrontation that was wearing him down. It was the realization that he had overestimated his own power. The manager was now visibly unraveling, his usual smugness replaced by a tense, twitching anger that only escalated as each second passed. He had lost control of the situation, and the more he tried to regain it, the more his authority seemed to slip through his fingers. Elon's calm, unwavering presence was like a constant pressure on him, making it clear that this confrontation would not end until Elon decided it would. The crowd, once hesitant, had grown still, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as though everyone knew something monumental was about to happen. Yet no one knew exactly what it would be. You're not in charge here, and you need to understand that, Elon repeated, his voice still even, but with a layer of finality that seemed to push the manager to the edge. This is a public space, and people like you don't get to dictate who belongs. The manager's hands balled into fists once more, the knuckles white. His chest heaved with each breath, and his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth seemed to grind. His attempt to assert dominance had failed, and now all that was left was his blind rage. But even in the midst of his fury, there was a flicker of something else, something more primal, that kept him rooted in place. His anger wasn't just directed at Elon. It was a rage born of his own sense of inadequacy, of his own inability to control this moment. You don't know anything about me, the manager snarled, his voice low and threatening. Yet there was a tremble beneath the words, a hint of uncertainty. You think just because you have money and power, you can walk in here and change everything? You're nothing but a joke. Elon didn't flinch, didn't show any reaction to the insult. He had heard it all before. People like the manager, whose only source of power was in their ability to belittle others. But there was something different about this time, something that felt more dangerous. The manager's words were fueled by desperation, and that desperation was pushing him further into a corner where there was no way out. He had underestimated Elon, and now he was paying the price. You're right, Elon said slowly, his words cutting through the tension with surgical precision. I do have money and power, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because what you're doing is wrong. And wrong doesn't need money or power to be righted. The manager's face twisted into a grimace, his breathing becoming more erratic. It was clear now that his anger was spiraling out of control, but he was still too proud to back down. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted around, searching for support. But all he found was the silent crowd, some observing cautiously, others with expressions of quiet judgment. You don't know how things work here, the manager growled, his voice suddenly laced with venom. I've been doing this for years. People like you, they come and go. But people like me, we're the ones who stay. Elon's eyes never left the manager, his expression calm but filled with a quiet intensity. People like you stay because you're allowed to, but that doesn't mean you deserve to. It just means no one has ever had the courage to challenge you. The manager recoiled, as if struck by the words. His pride, already bruised, took another hit. It was a truth he hadn't wanted to hear, hadn't wanted to acknowledge. He had built his little kingdom in the cafe, a place where he was king, where his word was law, and where anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world was an outsider. But Elon was exposing the cracks in his fortress, showing him that his control was a facade, held up by little more than fear and intimidation. You think you're going to get away with this? The manager hissed, now backing away slightly, his eyes wide with panic. You don't get to come here and make demands. Elon took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The manager's retreat was a clear sign of his unraveling grip, but it also fueled the manager's rage. His pride was at stake now, and his desperation grew by the second. His voice cracked as he spoke again, his anger turning to something darker. "I'm not going anywhere," the manager spat, his words slashing through the air. "And you can't make me." The challenge was clear now. The manager wasn't just trying to push back against Elon's moral stance. He was attempting to reclaim his diminishing power, to reassert himself as the one in control. But Elon, cool and collected, showed no sign of backing down. He understood that power wasn't about how loudly you spoke or how forcefully you acted. It was about the control you held over the situation, and right now the manager had none. Elon was the one in charge, whether the manager realized it or not. "You're not in control of this situation," Elon said quietly. "You're losing it." The words seemed to break something inside the manager. His face flushed crimson, his chest heaving with each breath. The people around them were silent now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were locked on the two men, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the manager's false bravado. The manager's fists clenched once more, his arms shaking with the effort. He was out of options, cornered by his own ego, his pride, and the growing realization that he had no power here. "You're not even worth my time," the manager muttered, stepping back and throwing his hands up in the air in frustration, his face a mask of anger and humiliation. "This isn't worth it." Elon didn't respond. He didn't need to. The manager's breakdown was the answer in itself. But the manager wasn't done yet. In a last, desperate attempt to regain control, he pointed toward the cafe's exit. "Leave," he ordered, his voice shaking. "You're nothing but a troublemaker. And you don't belong here." Elon stood still, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't moving. He wasn't leaving. The manager's power was gone, and everyone around them could see it. Elon wasn't just confronting him. He was exposing him for the fraud he was, revealing that the power the manager had so carefully cultivated was based on nothing more than a lie. The manager's face had twisted into a mask of frustration and defeat, but his pride wouldn't allow him to walk away. His shoulders were hunched, his breath ragged, and his hands still clenched into fists. His stance was defensive now, almost as if he were preparing for a fight he knew he couldn't win, but was too stubborn to give up on. Elon stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on the manager, unwavering in their intensity. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough to send a message. The crowd, still watching, was now completely silent. They had seen the manager falter, seen him shrink under Elon's gaze. The power had shifted so suddenly that it was almost palpable, the tension thick enough to choke on. "You really think I'm just going to let you walk all over me?" The manager snarled, stepping forward again, his fists tightening as if he were about to strike. His chest heaved, his anger flaring up once more. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Elon's expression never wavered. His stance remained relaxed, but there was a quiet strength behind his eyes, a resolve that was far more threatening than any display of physical aggression. He took a step forward as well, closing the distance between them. The air seemed to hum with the weight of the moment, the power shifting inexorably in his favor. "I don't need to know who you are," Elon replied coolly, his voice calm but firm. "What I know is that you're just another man who thinks he can use fear to control others. But it's not going to work this time." The manager's face reddened, his teeth gritting as he processed the words. He had tried to intimidate Elon, to push him out of the situation with his words and his presence. But it wasn't working. Elon wasn't reacting the way he expected. He wasn't shrinking, he wasn't backing down. And that realization gnawed at the manager, eroding his confidence. "People like you, they always think they can fix everything," the manager hissed, his voice low, almost venomous. "You think because you're some big-shot billionaire you can just come in and make demands, change things? But that's not how it works." Elon's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze sharp. "It's exactly how it works when people like you are allowed to get away with things like this." He gestured toward the woman still sitting at the table, her eyes now wide with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "You're treating people like they're inferior, like they don't have a place here. And that's the problem." The manager flinched, the words cutting deeper than he would admit. His posture stiffened as he tried to maintain some semblance of authority. But it was clear to anyone watching that he had lost the battle for control. He was no longer the one in charge of the situation. He was being driven into a corner by his own actions, and there was no way out. "You don't get it," the manager muttered, more to himself than to Elon. "You don't get how this works." Elon took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. "I get it just fine," he said quietly, but the weight of his words hit like a hammer. "I get that you think your position gives you the right to hurt others, to make them feel small. But that's not power. That's fear." The manager's breath quickened. He had no answer to that. The truth of Elon's words sank in slowly, a bitter pill that he didn't want to swallow. But there it was, undeniable. All this time, he had relied on fear to keep people in line. And now, facing Elon, he realized just how fragile that power truly was. The fear he had tried to instill in the woman, in the customers, in Elon himself, had been nothing more than a facade. He stepped back again, his eyes darting around, searching for a way to salvage what little pride he had left. But it was too late. His control had slipped through his fingers like sand, and now, all he had left was his rage. "You're wrong," the manager hissed, his voice trembling with the weight of his emotions. "You think you can change things? You think you can fix everything just by showing up and telling people how to behave?" Elon didn't flinch. His response was almost immediate, his voice steady and unwavering. "I don't think I can fix everything, but I can start by making sure people like you don't get away with this anymore." The words hung in the air, charged with finality. The manager's face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. His gaze flicked between Elon and the woman, and for a brief moment, he looked as though he might explode, that the rage inside him would burst free. But then, something changed. It was almost imperceptible, the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The facade of control he had been holding onto was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You can't just come in here and," the manager stammered, his voice faltering. But the words were weak now, lacking the conviction they had carried earlier. The fight was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of defeat. Elon watched him carefully, his gaze never leaving the manager's face. "You can keep trying to push me," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "But I'm not going anywhere, and neither is she." The woman, who had been silent until now, stood up from her seat. She had been watching, processing everything that had unfolded before her. And now, she stepped forward. The moment she rose, the crowd seemed to shift. A collective breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. "Don't touch me," the woman said, her voice firm, her eyes never leaving the manager's. "You've already done enough." The manager froze. It was as though the world had gone silent for a moment, and in that silence, his power completely evaporated. The crowd was watching, waiting, but the tension had turned in Elon and the woman's favor. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a reckoning. The manager's face was pale now, his pride shattered, his anger spent. His shoulders sagged as he realized that his attempts to assert control had failed, that he had lost something far more important than this petty exchange. He had lost his dignity, and in that loss, he had gained nothing but humiliation. The manager stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that would never come. His shoulders slumped, his pride shattered before him like a broken statue. Elon remained still, his eyes sharp and unwavering, observing the shift in the manager's demeanor with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about winning for Elon. It was about restoring the balance that had been violently disrupted by someone who thought they could control others without consequence. But now, the manager had nowhere to go but down. The woman, still standing, looked back at Elon, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had been the target of the manager's cruelty, but now, as the tide turned in her favor, she felt the weight of a small but powerful victory. She had stood up for herself, and Elon's intervention had given her the courage to keep going. It wasn't just about this one confrontation. It was about a message that was long overdue. The manager, still caught in his own spiral of confusion and anger, finally managed to speak. His voice trembled, a weak attempt at reclaiming some semblance of power. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered, almost to himself, his eyes now avoiding Elon's gaze. "You think you've fixed something? You think just because you showed up, you've changed everything?" Elon took a deliberate step forward, his posture unyielding, his presence commanding. "I haven't fixed anything," he said evenly, his words deliberate, as if each one had weight. "But I've shown you something. I've shown you that the world doesn't work the way you think it does. People like you don't get to push people like her around anymore. And I'm not going to let it happen." The manager's gaze flickered briefly to the woman, who was now standing tall, her shoulders back, her body language radiating strength. It was clear that she no longer feared him, that whatever power he had once held over her had evaporated in the face of Elon's intervention. She wasn't just standing up to him now. She was reclaiming her space in the world. The crowd had been watching in tense silence, their eyes darting between Elon and the manager. Some had hoped for this moment, some had feared it, but now that it was unfolding, no one could deny the shift in the power dynamic. The manager's authority had been an illusion, propped up by fear and silence. And now that illusion was shattered. "You're nothing," the manager spat, the venom in his words as sharp as the hatred in his eyes. He took another step back, his hands still clenched into fists. He had been defeated in front of his own customers, his own space, and the realization was starting to sting. "You don't get to tell people they're nothing," Elon replied, his voice unwavering. "Not anymore." There was a moment of complete stillness, the silence hanging heavily over the cafe, as the manager weighed his next move. His eyes flickered with something between anger and fear, and for a brief second, Elon saw the full extent of the manager's desperation. It wasn't just his pride that had been wounded, it was the realization that he had lost control, that everything he thought he knew about power was wrong. This wasn't a battle he could win by bullying or throwing his weight around. In fact, that was precisely the reason he had lost. "Get out of here," the manager barked, his voice rising, though it lacked the strength it once had. "You think you can walk in here and tell me what to do? I don't need this. I don't need you." Elon stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until you understand that you can't treat people this way. Not anymore." The woman stepped forward now, her voice firm but calm. "You've already lost," she said, her eyes locking onto the manager's. "You've lost everything, and it's your own fault." The manager's face twisted, and for a brief moment, he looked like he might lash out. Physically, verbally, anything to regain some sense of control. But he knew, deep down, that any further aggression would only make him look weaker. He had no ground to stand on. The people around them, those who had witnessed the entire exchange, were not on his side. They were silent, watching, waiting. The fact that he had lost the crowd made the reality of his defeat sink in deeper. "Do you even know who I am?" the manager demanded, his voice raw with frustration. "Do you know what I've done here? How long I've been in charge?" Elon didn't flinch. "I don't care who you are. What matters is how you treat people." The manager's face darkened as the words hit him. The realization that his position was no longer safe, no longer unquestioned, settled into him like a heavy weight. The world was shifting around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He wasn't the person he had been moments before. His facade had cracked, and he was left exposed, vulnerable, unable to regain control. "You'll regret this," the manager said bitterly, as if trying to salvage the last shreds of his dignity. "I'll make sure you regret it." Elon smiled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "The only person you need to worry about regretting anything is you." The manager's eyes flashed with a final burst of anger. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the woman stepped even closer to him, her voice cool and collected. "You've already lost," she repeated, more firmly this time. "There's nothing left for you here." And with those words, the manager's last grip on the situation slipped away entirely. He was finished. Elon turned to the woman, giving her a small nod of reassurance. He didn't need to say anything more. He had done what he came to do. The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no fear in them. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, a quiet strength radiating from her. For a long moment, no one moved. The crowd, still silent, seemed to hold its collective breath, as though waiting for something to happen. But the truth had already settled in. The power had shifted, the scales tipped, and the manager's reign of fear had come to an end. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't oppressive. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence filled with understanding. The people around them understood what had just transpired, even if they couldn't articulate it. What mattered wasn't just the confrontation itself. It was the message that had been sent. The manager's fists were still clenched, though the anger in his eyes had diminished into something far less intimidating: fear. It was clear now that he was not going to regain control of the situation. Every attempt he made to escalate, to regain the upper hand, was falling flat. The woman had stood up to him, Elon had stood with her, and the crowd that had gathered was silently, but decisively, in support of what was right. His pride had been torn apart, and his desperate attempts to hold on to his illusion of power only exposed how fragile that power had always been. For a moment, the manager stood frozen, unable to move, the weight of his loss pressing down on him. His gaze shifted between Elon and the woman, the crowd surrounding them, each passing second driving him further into a corner of isolation and humiliation. His own words, which had once seemed so sharp, had lost their sting. The confidence he had carried himself with earlier, that sense of superiority that had come from holding a small amount of power over others, was now gone. In its place was an overwhelming sense of weakness. Elon, for his part, remained calm, but there was an air of quiet authority about him. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't basking in his victory. He simply stood, watching the manager, waiting for him to come to terms with the reality that he no longer had control. Elon's demeanor remained unchanged, steady, resolute, and fully aware that this was the turning point. "You're finished here," the woman spoke again, her voice firm, yet calm. She had found her courage, her confidence rising as the moments passed. "You don't belong in a place like this. Not anymore." The manager's face twisted, a pained, almost defeated expression crossing his features. The words stung, but more than that, they reminded him of just how much he had lost. All the years he had spent building this facade of control, all the moments he had bullied others into submission, were now irrelevant. The woman's words weren't just an insult. They were the truth, a truth that he had no defense against. I don't need this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His back was still straight, his body trembling, but the bravado had long since vanished. "I don't need any of this." Elon's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice still calm, still measured. "No, you don't. You never needed it in the first place." For a brief moment, the manager seemed to hesitate, as though there was something more he wanted to say, some final word that could salvage his dignity. But no words came. All that was left was the sickening realization that his authority had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. His posture sagged, the defiance that had once fueled him slowly dissipating. "You really think this changes anything?" the manager spat, his voice shaky with anger but tinged with a hint of desperation. "You think you've won? You think this cafe is just going to—" "It's not just the cafe," Elon interrupted, his voice cutting through the manager's words. "It's the people. And it's about time someone made sure you understood that." The manager's shoulders drooped, and he took a step back, the last vestiges of his anger now replaced by a bitter resignation. His hands were no longer fists. They hung limp by his sides, as if he no longer knew what to do with them. He was broken, defeated not physically but mentally, emotionally. His role, his sense of superiority, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed for the first time in years. Around them, the crowd remained still, watching, waiting. Some were still processing what had happened, while others were beginning to understand the significance of the moment. The shift in power was clear, but the resolution had not yet come. Elon wasn't done. He wasn't here just to correct one moment of injustice. He was here to make sure that the manager's arrogance didn't go unchallenged. "You've spent your life trying to control people," Elon said, his voice low but filled with the weight of truth. "But the truth is, the world isn't yours to control. Not anymore." The words landed with a finality that seemed to shake the manager to his core. It was as if the very ground beneath him was crumbling away. His grip on the situation, on the world he had tried so hard to dominate, had disintegrated. He wasn't just losing this confrontation. He was losing everything he thought he understood about his place in the world. The woman stepped forward, her eyes now filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. She had been silent for most of this exchange, letting Elon do the talking, but now she had found her voice. The man who had tried to intimidate her, belittle her, had been brought to his knees, not by force, but by the power of standing up for what was right. "You'll never be in charge here again," she said, her words carrying the weight of the truth, the final seal on this chapter of the manager's fall from grace. Not while people like him are around. The manager looked at her, his face pale, his eyes wide. The reality of what had just transpired seemed to hit him all at once, crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had been exposed. His false sense of power, his manipulative control, had been shattered in front of everyone. There was no recovering from this. Elon turned to the woman, offering her a look of quiet understanding. There was no need for words between them anymore. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had taken back her dignity. He had done what he came here to do, not just to confront the manager, but to make sure that this would never happen again, to ensure that others like the manager would know their place, that the balance of power could no longer be tilted so easily. The silence that had filled the air now seemed to settle like dust, slowly drifting down, leaving behind a space where the manager's authority once stood. He was still there, but he no longer commanded respect. Instead, he stood as a broken man, his eyes darting around as if hoping for someone to rescue him. But no one would. No one could. The manager stumbled backward, his hands trembling as if he couldn't grasp the enormity of his failure. His eyes darted toward the exit, the desire to escape the humiliating scene clear in his expression. But he didn't move. He could feel every eye on him, the silent judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. He had tried to control the situation, to bend it to his will, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. There was no easy escape now, no quick exit to save his face. Elon stood, unwavering, watching him with a look that was equal parts disappointment and calm certainty. The manager's words faltered before they left his mouth. His once aggressive stance now wilted under the unrelenting pressure. "You can't just walk away," the manager spat, trying to muster some semblance of his previous confidence. "You think this is over?" The words hung in the air, fragile, almost pitiful in their defiance. But there was no longer any conviction behind them. The battle had shifted. It was clear to everyone around them, even to him, that his time was up. The people watching had seen the power dynamics unravel in real time. How quickly the manager, who once seemed so assured of his position, had fallen under the weight of his own arrogance. Elon didn't reply immediately. His gaze didn't waver from the manager's face, nor did he make a move. He stood there, allowing the manager's futile attempts to regain his composure to play out. He wasn't in any rush. The more the manager tried to salvage the situation, the more it became clear that this wouldn't end on his terms. "You really think I'm afraid of you?" The manager's voice trembled with barely contained anger. His back was against the wall now, figuratively and literally. He had no way out, and the longer he stood there, locked in the confrontation, the more his defeat settled into his chest like a heavy weight. But still, he tried. He wasn't ready to let it go. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Elon took a slow step forward. The shift was subtle, but it was enough to make the manager's blood run cold. His confidence was crumbling with every breath he took, every word he failed to deliver with authority. The man who had once commanded respect in this space, even through fear, was now nothing but a shadow of that person. "I don't need to know who you are," Elon said quietly, his tone a mix of calm and cold indifference. "What I do know is that you've lost, and there's no coming back from this." The words felt like ice against the manager's already frayed nerves. He took another faltering step back, his gaze sweeping across the cafe, as if he were looking for someone to back him up, to save him from this overwhelming sense of defeat. But there was no one. The faces around him were not sympathetic. They were not backing him up. No one was looking to him for guidance, for support. They were waiting for him to make the next move, to continue his pitiful attempt to regain the power he had already lost. "Why don't you just leave?" The woman spoke again, her voice steady, her stance unshaken. She wasn't speaking to Elon anymore, but to the manager. Her gaze was unflinching. "There's nothing left for you here." The words cut through the heavy silence, but the manager didn't move. Instead, he took another step forward, this time trying to close the distance between them, his voice growing louder, more desperate. "You can't do this. You can't just take my life like this." But it was too late. His words had no weight anymore. They hung in the air, powerless, lost in the sea of judgment that surrounded him. He was trying to assert dominance, but he had already lost the battle, and everyone around him could see it. The crowd was silent now, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene playing out before them. It was as if the cafe had transformed into a stage, with everyone watching the unraveling of a man who had relied too long on intimidation. There were no cheers for his downfall, no applause. There was only the oppressive quiet that accompanied the inevitable collapse of someone who had used cruelty as a shield, only to have it shattered by someone willing to stand up to it. Elon didn't need to say anything more. He wasn't here to humiliate the man. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to expose him for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind false power. Elon's silence was as potent as any words he could have spoken. He was not backing down, not leaving. He stood there, a wall of unshakable resolve, waiting for the manager to face the full weight of his actions. But the manager wasn't ready to back down. The anger inside him was boiling over, his temper flaring one last time. "You don't know what you're dealing with?" he yelled, voice cracking under the strain. "I'll make sure you regret this. You and your little friends. You think you can just come in here and ruin me?" Elon didn't flinch. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He simply stood his ground, letting the manager's words dissipate into the air around them. The manager's threats meant nothing now. The more he shouted, the more it became clear. He was out of options. "You've already lost," Elon finally said, the words carrying a weight that only grew as the silence stretched between them. His voice was low, his tone sharp. "And you'll keep losing, as long as you keep trying to hold on to this illusion of control." The manager's face twisted in frustration. He couldn't stand it anymore. The way Elon's words pierced through him like daggers, stripping away whatever dignity he had left. His pride, the one thing that had kept him going through years of cruelty and intimidation, was gone. There was no escaping the truth anymore. "Get out of my face," the manager screamed, his voice raw and wild with rage. "I'll make sure you—" Elon took a slow, deliberate step toward him, and for the first time the manager flinched. His body stiffened, his resolve wavering. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, a crack in his armor that exposed him for who he truly was. He was no longer the man who had walked into the cafe, expecting to control everything around him. Now he was a broken figure, desperate and unsure, facing down the consequences of his actions. The manager stood rooted to the spot, his chest heaving as his anger and frustration spiraled out of control. His hands were shaking now, trembling violently, as if his body could no longer contain the overwhelming flood of emotions. He had always been a man who thrived on dominance, on the illusion of control, but that illusion was long gone. The more he tried to maintain his facade, the more it cracked, revealing the weak and fragile man beneath. Elon Musk watched him closely, unmoving, his presence heavy in the air. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't moving. Every word the manager uttered only dug him deeper into his own hole, the weight of his failure growing with each desperate attempt to reclaim his position. "You think this is funny?" the manager finally snapped, his voice jagged and hoarse. He turned sharply, trying to shift his gaze away from Elon, but there was no escaping it. The crowd, still watching, seemed to draw in closer, their silent observations a reminder of just how outmatched the manager truly was. Elon didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His gaze remained steady, unblinking, as if he were waiting for the manager to fully understand that there was no escape, no way to salvage his pride. It wasn't about proving a point anymore, it was about exposing the man for who he was. His attempts to intimidate, to bully, had failed. And now, in his final moments of desperation, he was trying to hold onto something that was already slipping from his grasp. "You don't belong here," the manager shouted, his face flushed with rage. "You think you can just walk in and change everything, make everyone believe you're right? You think you're better than me?" The words hung in the air, empty and meaningless. They had lost their power, their impact, the moment they left his lips. The crowd remained silent, but the weight of their collective gaze felt heavier than any words could be. It was as if they were watching a man drown in his own ego, slowly sinking under the waves of his failure. Elon's expression remained unchanged. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset. There was nothing but a quiet, unyielding force radiating from him. It wasn't power that Elon wielded, it was the force of truth, and the manager was being crushed under the weight of it. "You've had your time," Elon said finally, his voice calm but carrying a finality that made the words feel like a sentence. "And now it's over. Your control, your intimidation, your bullying. It's all gone." The manager's eyes flashed with anger once again. But this time, there was something else behind them. A flicker of fear, of understanding. He was losing. The more he fought, the more desperate he became, and the more it became apparent to everyone in the cafe that his words had no meaning. His outbursts were nothing but the last gasps of a man who had lost everything. "You think you've won?" The manager spat, taking a half step back, his body tense, still trying to maintain the illusion that he was in control of the situation. "I'll make sure you regret this. I swear, You've already lost," Elon interrupted, his tone cutting through the manager's rant like a knife. There was no room for argument anymore, no room for further defiance. The manager's words were meaningless. He was no longer the one who commanded attention, who controlled the narrative. The manager's eyes darted around, looking for someone to back him up, someone to make him feel powerful again. But there was no one. The crowd, still standing silent, had already made their decision. The power dynamics in this space had shifted irreparably. There was no returning to the old ways. "Get out of here," the manager hissed, his voice strained and desperate. He was now backing away, retreating, as if trying to put some distance between himself and the reality of his defeat. His steps were shaky, unsure, the very picture of a man who knew he had nowhere left to go. Elon didn't move. He remained where he was, watching the manager with unflinching eyes. "You don't tell me what to do," Elon said, his words slow and deliberate. "You're done here, and you know it." The manager's eyes widened in a mix of disbelief and fury. He tried once more to assert himself, but there was nothing left. His earlier confidence, his bravado had completely evaporated. He had tried to maintain his control over the situation, but now, faced with the overwhelming truth, he was powerless. "I'm not going anywhere," the manager muttered under his breath, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. His back was already to the crowd, his body turned toward the exit, and his steps were hesitant, faltering. He wasn't walking away as someone who had maintained his dignity. He was leaving as a man who had been broken. His pride shattered, his authority crumbled. "You're not welcome here anymore," the woman said again, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't speaking to Elon anymore, but to the manager. She had done her part. She had stood up to him, and now it was clear that she had already won. The manager was no longer the threat he once was. He was a broken figure, defeated by his own arrogance. The manager turned, his face red with shame and anger, and walked toward the door, his movements stiff and uncertain. He wasn't walking out with any sense of dignity. He wasn't walking out with any of the authority he had once believed he held. He was walking out as someone who had been stripped of everything, who had failed to maintain the very thing he had spent years building. As the door swung open and the manager exited, the weight of the moment hung in the air, still lingering in the cafe. The silence that followed was palpable, as if everyone present was processing what they had just witnessed. No one spoke for a long moment. No one moved. There was nothing but the heavy air, thick with the tension of what had just transpired. And still, Elon stood, unyielding, watching the scene unfold with quiet resolve. There was no sense of triumph in his expression, only the quiet understanding that the battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The door slammed shut behind the manager with a sharp finality that echoed through the cafe. The tension in the air remained thick, and the crowd, though still, had not yet fully exhaled. The silence that followed felt as heavy as the words that had been exchanged, like a breath held in anticipation of the next move. No one knew what would come next, but it was clear that the space had changed. Elon stood at the center of it all, his expression unyielding, his posture still relaxed but emanating a quiet intensity. The woman beside him, her figure now steady and upright, had yet to say a word. The aftermath of the confrontation had left both of them in the eye of a storm that seemed to swirl around them, but neither had moved. Neither had broken. There was a lingering buzz in the room, though no one dared to speak. The people who had been watching now shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking toward Elon, then toward each other. The lines had been drawn. Some were still processing the confrontation, some were unsure of how to react, and others were perhaps unsure of their own place in it all. But one thing was certain. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and the ground was still trembling. Elon glanced briefly around the cafe, meeting the eyes of a few patrons who seemed to be waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. His gaze lingered on the woman next to him for a moment, a brief but purposeful connection before he turned back to face the empty space where the manager had once stood, now void of any remaining authority. "Are you all right?" Elon asked softly, his tone surprisingly gentle, as though the weight of the past moments had not been borne by him alone. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes still focused on the exit where the manager had disappeared. There was a quiet strength in her posture now, as if the culmination of what had happened was only beginning to settle in. "I don't know," she said after a beat, her voice low but firm, the tension of the past moments still clinging to her words. "I'm not sure." The words hung in the air, unanswered, as if the silence was still waiting for a resolution that no one was ready to give. Elon didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his gaze shifting once again toward the patrons who were watching, some unsure, some perhaps even nervous, their eyes darting away when his gaze met theirs. The crowd seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the first to speak, the first to break the unspoken pact that had been formed in the wake of the manager's departure. No one moved, no one spoke, but then, one voice cut through the tension, shaky but clear. "That was messed up," a man at the back of the cafe muttered, his voice rough with suppressed anger. "What kind of manager does that shit?" The words hung in the air, a ripple of acknowledgement moving through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others glanced at each other, unsure of what to make of the sudden opening. Elon shifted slightly, his attention now fully on the man who had spoken. "The kind who thinks they can get away with it," he said calmly, his voice steady, still not raised. "But he won't anymore. Not here." The man nodded, his eyes momentarily meeting Elon's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. But still, the crowd remained hesitant, as though unsure whether to engage or remain passive observers of the chaos that had unfolded. The manager's words, his threats and posturing, still lingered in the air, unfinished, unspent. His defeat had been too sudden, too complete, and it left a bitter residue that no one knew how to shake off. "I don't know if that was the right thing to do," a woman at the counter spoke up, her voice small but persistent. She had been watching the exchange from the beginning, but now, the uncertainty was creeping into her words. "He's the manager. What happens now?" Elon's eyes shifted toward her, meeting her gaze with a cool calm that seemed to settle the air around them. He didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit, unspoken in its weight, before he spoke again. Sometimes, Elon began slowly, the right thing to do is stand up and make sure someone knows they can't just walk all over people. Sometimes, you have to remind them that power built on fear isn't real power. His words struck a chord, but the room remained silent, like a bowstring pulled taut, waiting for the release. The question hung there, what happens now? But no one seemed ready to answer it. The room had transformed. The cafe that had once been a neutral ground, a place where people could come and go without thought, had now become something else. The power dynamics had shifted, and everyone in that room had witnessed it, whether they wanted to or not. The woman, still standing by Elon, took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You can't just let him get away with it," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had just endured. "But you also can't let him think he won." Elon nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the exit where the manager had fled. "He hasn't won," he said simply. "Not today." The room seemed to exhale at once, a collective release, but it was short-lived. The manager's departure had left a vacuum, and the absence of his influence still hung heavy in the air. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The question of what happened next still loomed over them all, unanswered. Elon's gaze swept over the patrons once more. He could see the hesitation in their eyes, the uncertainty of what to do with the power that had suddenly shifted in the room. He knew that the real conflict wasn't over. It was just beginning, and it wasn't going to be solved in this one moment. The manager might have been gone, but the questions he had raised still lingered. The unspoken tension between the people in the cafe, the balance of power they had all felt shift underfoot, had only just begun to unfold. The silence stretched, and the weight of it pressed down on them. No one moved, no one spoke. The room was thick with tension, a palpable heaviness that seemed to close in on every corner. The manager had left, but his presence lingered, like a ghost haunting the cafe. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to fully relax, unsure of what had just happened and what might come next. Elon stood in the center of it all, a silent pillar of defiance, while the woman beside him remained just as still, her eyes flicking to the door the manager had exited through, as though expecting him to burst back in at any moment. But he didn't. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as if everyone was waiting for someone to make the next move. The conversations that had once filled the air were now absent, replaced by whispers, glances, and the heavy weight of uncertainty. A man at a corner table finally broke the silence, his voice sharp, tinged with disbelief. "What happens now?" he asked, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Elon or to the group as a whole. His question hung in the air, an unsettling query that nobody seemed eager to answer. Elon didn't immediately respond. He simply stood there, his arms crossed loosely, his eyes scanning the room. The truth was, he wasn't sure what would happen next either. What had just occurred was only the beginning of something much bigger. The manager was gone, but the dynamic in the room had changed in ways no one could predict. The cafe, once a simple space of daily interactions, had become the stage for a larger conflict, one that was far from over. One of the patrons, a woman sitting near the counter, shifted uneasily in her chair. "You think he's just going to leave it at that?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. "He'll be back. He won't just let this slide." Her words hung in the air, a grim possibility that seemed to confirm what everyone was secretly afraid of. The manager, despite his humiliation, wasn't the type to walk away without exacting some form of revenge. The question was not if he would return, but when. "Who knows?" Elon responded finally, his voice calm but edged with the uncertainty of the situation. "But it doesn't matter if he comes back. The point is, he can't control this place anymore, and he won't be able to control anyone here ever again." But his words did little to dispel the unease that had settled over the crowd. The reality was that, as much as the manager had been exposed for what he truly was, there was still an air of fear in the cafe. People had witnessed a shift in the balance of power, but no one had fully processed what it meant. There was still a nervous energy, a sense that things weren't finished yet. The woman beside Elon spoke again, her voice quiet but laced with conviction. "We're not safe, not really," she said, her eyes meeting Elon's. "The man who was here, the one who made everyone afraid to speak up, he's gone. But the power he wielded, the fear he instilled, it's still here. It's in the air, in the way people look at each other." Elon turned to her, his gaze steady. "It doesn't have to be," he replied. We're the ones who can change that. She looked at him, her eyes searching, weighing his words. But even as she nodded, something still gnawed at her. What had happened was a step forward, but it wasn't the end. The manager's retreat had shifted the power dynamic, yes, but it hadn't erased the fear he had instilled. People were still nervous, still unsure of what would come next, and that uncertainty lingered, clinging to the walls of the cafe. The man at the table near the door, who had spoken earlier, leaned forward, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "I don't care what happens," he said, his words thick with frustration. "I don't care who stands up to him or not. The guy was a tyrant, but now it feels like we're just waiting for him to come back and finish what he started." His words made the room shift again, a ripple of discomfort running through the group. No one liked to acknowledge it, but the truth was clear. Even with the manager gone, there was a sense that they were still under his thumb. The fear wasn't gone. It had only been momentarily disrupted. No one knew what the aftermath would look like, and that uncertainty was just as stifling as the manager's presence had been. Elon's eyes swept across the room, his gaze lingering on the various faces, those who were still waiting for something, anything, to happen. He could see the fear, the hesitation, the doubt. These were the marks of people who had been controlled, whether they wanted to admit it or not. And that wasn't something that would disappear overnight. Fear doesn't go away just because one person is no longer in charge, Elon said, his voice louder now, commanding attention. It lingers, festers, but it can be beaten. Not by one person standing up, but by everyone deciding that they're done being afraid. That's the only way it ends. His words, though powerful, didn't seem to completely break the tension. It was as if the crowd was waiting for something more, waiting for proof that this was truly the end of the manager's reign, waiting for some kind of concrete change. No one moved. No one spoke. The woman who had been standing beside Elon finally broke her silence again. Her voice softer this time, but still carrying the weight of the situation. "But how do we do that?" she asked, her eyes still searching Elon's face. "How do we get rid of the fear when it's already taken root? We can't just pretend it's gone." Elon's eyes softened for a moment, and he took a step closer to her. "We start by refusing to let it control us. One person at a time. We start by not letting people like him win again." But even as he spoke, he could feel the air around him change. The room had gone still, each person locked in their own internal battle. Some were ready to follow, ready to stand up and push forward. But others were still hesitant, unsure, waiting for the next shoe to drop. "You really think this is over?" the man at the back table asked again, his voice sharp with skepticism. "You think just because he's gone, that means we've won? You think things are going to be different now?" Elon's gaze hardened, his expression steady. "It's not over, but it will be if we don't let it continue. The question is, are we ready to fight for that? Or will we let it happen again?" The man at the table didn't answer. Instead, he sat back, his arms crossed tightly, his eyes narrowing. He was a man caught between the comfort of the old order and the uncertainty of what could come next. He wasn't ready to let go of his fear. Not yet. The woman beside Elon spoke again, her voice firm. "We can't wait forever. We have to decide what we stand for." The crowd seemed to hold its breath, the room once again thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. Each person caught in the tug of war between action and inaction, between fear and courage. The silence in the cafe stretched long, like a taut wire ready to snap. The weight of the conversation, the tension in the room, pressed down on everyone present. Elon remained in the center, his presence undeniable, but the air felt thick with unease. The group was fractured. Some were watching, others were processing, and still others were too afraid to speak up. The manager may have been gone, but the ripples of his tyranny still lingered, and the fear he had instilled wasn't so easily washed away. "How long do you think it'll take for someone else to step in and take his place?" the man at the back table muttered, his voice breaking the stillness. "One person's gone, but the system's still the same. The next person who steps in, they'll be just as bad." His words hit harder than he likely intended. There was a collective shift in the room. as if everyone had been jolted awake from some collective dream they hadn't even realized they were in. The man's words weren't entirely wrong. The manager had been a figurehead, but what was the real root of the problem? The fear, the power dynamics, the manipulation, it wasn't confined to just one man. It was in the culture, in the unspoken rules that governed the space. It was in the quiet resignation of everyone who had ever put up with it, in the countless times they had been afraid to speak out. Elon's eyes flicked toward the man who had spoken, his gaze sharp, but his voice remained steady. "You're right," he said simply, "but just because someone else could step in doesn't mean they will. And if they do, then it's our job to make sure they don't have the power he did." The room was still. No one spoke, but the weight of the words hung in the air, the truth settling uncomfortably in the hearts of the crowd. It wasn't just about one person's downfall. It was about the systems that allowed people like him to rise in the first place. It was about how easily people allowed themselves to be swept up in the fear, how quickly they accepted it because it was easier than standing up. A voice broke through the heavy pause. "You can't change the system by just standing here," a woman spoke from a corner, her voice a mix of skepticism and frustration. "You can't expect people to just follow you because you say the words. Fear doesn't go away like that." She was right. The fear didn't just disappear. It wasn't a flick of a switch that could be undone by a few righteous words. It had been cultivated over time, and now it had taken root in everyone present. The question wasn't whether they could face the manager. It was whether they could face themselves, whether they could overcome the apathy that had allowed the fear to persist for so long. Elon's eyes didn't leave her as she spoke, and when she finished, he took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch again. His words were quieter now, but no less impactful. "I'm not asking anyone to follow me," he said. "I'm asking everyone here to stop letting fear decide what happens next. We can't change everything in one day, but we can start by choosing not to be afraid anymore." The words landed with a heavy silence, and for the first time, someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The woman who had spoken earlier, still holding on to her skepticism, now looked around, her expression flickering as if she wasn't so sure anymore. But doubt still clouded the room, as the power of years of fear couldn't be undone by a few words alone. "You think we just stand up, and everything changes?" The man from the back table pressed again, his tone challenging, desperate for a reason not to believe. "What happens when the next guy comes in? What do we do then? What if it's worse?" His words cracked through the growing sense of unity, reminding everyone of the reality they were facing. This wasn't just about the manager. This was about the fear that had festered for so long, about the people who had let it fester because they didn't know any other way. The fear of being fired, of being ostracized, of being punished, those were powerful motivators. The fear of standing out, of being seen as different, kept everyone in line. "That's the question, isn't it?" Elon replied, his voice firm, despite the doubt that swirled in the air. "What happens when they come back? But we can't change that unless we make the choice to stand up now. If we wait, nothing changes. And the fear continues to control us." The woman who had spoken earlier, still watching with a mixture of fear and defiance in her eyes, stood slowly, her eyes flicking from person to person. There was hesitation in her movements, but there was something more than that now. Something more than just fear. A spark of courage? A flicker of hope? It was hard to say, but for the first time she wasn't sitting back, wasn't shrinking. She was standing tall, her posture slightly straighter than before. "You think this is easy?" she asked, her voice still uncertain but laced with something else. "You think we just flip a switch and everyone's on board? We're scared. And that's not going to go away by just standing here and talking." Her words were the reality check everyone had been avoiding. The fight hadn't even begun. They had only just started to realize the depth of what they were up against, the fear that had been so deeply ingrained in them. The cafe was still, save for the murmurs of discontent and doubt creeping through the crowd. The question hung heavily in the air, and for a moment, the silence seemed to swallow the room. It wasn't enough to simply talk about standing up. It wasn't enough to simply confront the one man who had been in charge. There was a deep-rooted culture, a system that had allowed the manager to thrive. And now, They were all left wondering if it was even possible to break free from it. Elon's eyes swept over the room again, meeting the gaze of the woman who had spoken up, then the man at the back. There was no answer yet, no solution, no quick fix. All he had was the same truth he'd started with. Fear could be beaten, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. "Then we start with us," he said, his voice steady, more resolute than before. "We start with this, with today." But the words barely made it through the thick air. The silence pressed down harder, and the faces around him remained uncertain, waiting not for answers, but for something else, something that had not yet come. The silence in the cafe grew thicker, the weight of each unspoken thought pressing down on the group like a storm just waiting to break. Elon stood at the center, his figure steady and firm, but the atmosphere around him felt charged, like electricity in the air, as if something was building, something was about to explode. The people in the room had heard the words, had felt the shift, but no one was moving. No one knew what to do with the energy that had been released. The manager had fled, but the real battle had only just begun. Fear wasn't something you could easily dismiss, and the discomfort in the room wasn't just a product of the manager's departure. It was the discomfort of not knowing what happened next, of being left in the limbo of uncertainty. "Is this it then?" the woman near the counter asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "Are we just supposed to keep waiting for someone else to show up and make decisions for us?" Elon looked at her, his eyes unwavering. "You think it's that simple?" he replied, his tone steady but carrying the weight of the question. "You think we just keep standing here, doing nothing, and wait for everything to fix itself?" She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she tried to gather her thoughts. Her gaze flickered between the people around them, the faces of those who had been watching, unsure of what to say next. Her frustration was growing, but there was something else simmering beneath the surface. A realization that the fear, the hesitation, wasn't going to go away by waiting. "We've been waiting," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less forceful. "We've all been waiting for something to change. But the truth is, nothing changes unless we make it change." The words hung in the air, a challenge thrown into the room, but still, no one moved. The crowd seemed frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed. The weight of the decision pressed down on them all, and as much as they had witnessed the shift, the moment had not yet reached its climax. They were still stuck in the limbo of uncertainty. A man at a nearby table, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "You're all talking like it's some kind of revolution," he said, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Do you really think we can just decide to make everything different? Do you think standing here and talking about it is going to change anything?" His words were like a spark to dry kindling. The room stirred, people shifting in their seats, the tension rising again. His question was one everyone had been avoiding, one that no one wanted to confront, but it was there, lingering. It wasn't about standing up to the manager anymore. It was about something much bigger, the decision to keep fighting or walk away. The woman who had spoken before, now visibly frustrated, stood up straighter, her hands clenched at her sides. "We've been told to shut up for too long," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and resolve. "We've been told to stay in line, to stay quiet, to not make waves. But look where that got us. Where are we now, huh? The manager's gone, but nothing's really changed." Elon watched the exchange, his expression unreadable, his presence still as unwavering as ever. The truth of her words struck at something deeper, something no one had wanted to admit, not even to themselves. The fight against the manager was just one small victory, but it was never just about one person. It was about a system, a culture, a deep-rooted belief that power could be taken, that fear could be used to control, that people could be silenced. "You think you're the only one who's tired of being quiet?" the man from the back table retorted, his voice rising again. "We've all had enough. But what good does it do to shout at each other?" His frustration was palpable, his hands now gripping the edge of his table, as if trying to hold on to something before it slipped away. The tension was escalating again, building like a storm that no one seemed able to calm. His words cut through the crowd, But they weren't the answer anyone was looking for. They were just more questions, more doubt. "Nothing changes until we make it change," the woman replied, her voice steady now, louder with more conviction. "And we don't have to wait for someone else to decide when the change happens. We can do it now." The room fell into an eerie stillness again. People looked at each other, but no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. The weight of the decision of whether or not they were willing to take the first step loomed over them all. Elon didn't speak immediately, letting the tension build. His gaze swept across the room again, meeting the eyes of the people around him, reading the uncertainty, the doubt, the fear. He knew that this was the breaking point, the moment when everything could change, but only if they were willing to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had all been avoiding. "You think it's easy?" Elon finally said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You think standing up is a quick fix? It's not. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. It means stepping into the unknown, making a choice, and sticking with it when everything else around you tells you to back down. But the truth is, nothing gets better until we decide to make it better. And that means every single one of us here has to make that choice." The room was still again, the silence louder now than before, the air thick with the unspoken weight of his words. People glanced at each other, their faces unreadable. Some seemed to consider his words, their expressions flickering with doubt, while others seemed to retreat deeper into their own thoughts, unsure of how to move forward. The man at the table, his frustration growing, opened his mouth to speak again, but Elon cut him off, his voice steady. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm asking you to start thinking differently. I'm asking you to stop being afraid of what could happen, and start focusing on what will happen if we don't change." The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. The challenge was out there now, open and raw. No one had to follow. No one had to change. But they all had to make a choice. The choice to stand up, to face the fear head-on, or to continue living under it. As the room settled into yet another uncomfortable silence, the weight of the decision was inescapable. The manager had left, but something else had taken his place. Something that could either break them or make them stronger. The tension in the cafe was suffocating, every passing second carrying the weight of decisions yet to be made. The room felt like a powder keg, just waiting for the right spark to send it into flames. Elon stood at the center, his eyes scanning the room, watching the faces of the people around him. The words he had spoken hung in the air, but nothing had changed yet. People were still sitting, still waiting, unsure of what the next step should be. The silence stretched on, heavier than before, and Elon could feel it pressing down on him. But he didn't flinch. He knew that this moment right here was pivotal. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about all of them. Every person in the room, every person who had been too afraid to act. He wasn't their savior. They had to decide if they would be the ones to change their own fate. "You really think it's that easy?" A voice cut through the thick silence. It was a man from the back of the cafe, his tone thick with bitterness, his words carrying the weight of frustration. "You think just because you say it, everything changes? You think we just stand up and—" His words faltered, as if he was trying to find a way to explain the impossible. The weight of his own frustration seemed to be building up, and the tension in his voice cracked, revealing the deeper layers of doubt and fear he had been holding back. "What happens when you stand up?" he continued, his voice now trembling. "You get pushed back down. You get told to sit down and shut up. You think it's easy to just decide to fight, but it's not. It's never that simple." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the man's words hitting closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. Elon's eyes fixed on him, but this time there was no immediate response. Instead, Elon took a step forward, closer to the man, letting his presence fill the space. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, the next twist in the escalating conflict. The man recoiled slightly, but his anger still simmered beneath the surface. "You think we're all going to follow you? That we're just going to get up and walk out of here, fighting some imaginary battle you've decided to wage? You don't understand. You don't get what it's like." The words hung in the air, full of bitter truth, but also full of fear. There was a desperation in the man's voice, an attempt to drag Elon into the pit of doubt that he had been sinking into for so long. The tension was palpable now, every eye in the room shifting from Elon to the man and back again, as if the room was holding its breath for the explosion that felt imminent. Elon stood there for a moment, considering the words, but there was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "You're right," Elon said, his words slicing through the silence. "It's not easy. It's never easy. Standing up doesn't mean the fight is over. It's just the beginning. But we have to choose to start." The man scoffed, his frustration turning into something more hostile. "And what happens when we start? What happens when we rise up and it doesn't work? What happens when it all falls apart?" The room seemed to darken as if the very air around them had shifted, the weight of the question hanging like a dark cloud. The man wasn't asking for answers. He was asking for a way out, an excuse to go back to the comfortable silence, to the quiet acquiescence that had defined this place for so long. "I'm not asking you to follow me," Elon replied, his voice still calm but sharp. "I'm asking you to take control of your own life, of your own choices. I'm asking you to stop being afraid of what might happen and start deciding for yourself what happens next." The words landed hard, and for a moment, the man seemed to flinch. His gaze wavered, the defiance in his eyes replaced by something more vulnerable, something closer to fear. But before he could respond, the door to the cafe suddenly swung open with a force that rattled the room. All eyes snapped toward the entrance, and for a split second, there was a collective gasp, as if the room had been holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light from outside. The tall, broad-shouldered frame, the confident, almost predatory stance. It was unmistakable. It was the manager. The room froze. No one moved, no one spoke. The tension that had been building throughout the entire confrontation seemed to snap in an instant, the atmosphere charged with confusion and disbelief. He was back. For a moment, time seemed to stop, and the room was a cacophony of silent questions. How? Why? Was he really here again? The manager stood in the doorway, his gaze sweeping across the cafe, his eyes locking on Elon first, then on the crowd. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of calm control. He was back, but he didn't look like the same man who had fled in defeat just moments ago. There was something different about him, something darker, more dangerous. Elon's stance remained unchanged, but inside, he felt the tension spike again. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "You thought it was over," the manager said, his voice low and cutting, but carrying a weight of authority that had been absent before. "You thought I was finished. You thought you could just stand up and change things. But the truth is, you've only just started a war." The words sent a shiver through the room. The manager wasn't just talking about his personal defeat. He was talking about something bigger, something that threatened to engulf everyone in the cafe. His return wasn't just about him regaining control, it was about something much larger. A reminder that the battle they were facing wasn't just about him. It was about the system, the culture, the fear that had kept everyone in line for so long. The manager's eyes narrowed, his gaze settling on the woman who had stood with Elon, who had fought back. "You thought standing up was enough?" he sneered. "You thought you could change everything with one little confrontation?" Elon stepped forward slightly, his body tensing, preparing for whatever came next. The room held its breath again, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to move forward. "You haven't seen anything yet," the manager said, his voice now dark and dangerous. "But you will." The manager's voice echoed through the room, and for a moment, the cafe felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. He stood in the doorway, his presence commanding, casting a long shadow across the space. No one moved, no one spoke. The tension was suffocating, the uncertainty palpable. The manager's return wasn't just about reclaiming his position. It was a declaration, a challenge to everyone in the room. "You think you're going to change anything?" he spat, his words dripping with disdain as he took a step further into the cafe. You think standing up to me, standing up to the system is going to make a difference? Elon didn't flinch. His eyes locked on the managers, unbroken, as calm as ever. I didn't come here to change everything at once, Elon said slowly, his voice measured. But someone has to start somewhere. Someone has to be the first to stand up and say no. The room was quiet, the weight of Elon's words sinking in, but the manager was relentless. You think this little display, has any real power? He sneered, looking around at the patrons, who were still frozen in place, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. This isn't a movie. You don't get to play the hero, walk in, and change everything. You think you can take me down with a few words? You think any of this matters? The manager's anger was building, his words more desperate, more venomous. But for all his shouting, the power he once had seemed to slip further and further from his grasp. The cafe, once his domain, had become a place where his influence was beginning to fracture. People weren't looking at him with fear anymore. They were looking at him with judgment. You think I'm afraid of you? Elon responded, his voice unwavering, a quiet authority in his tone. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to make sure you understand that the fear you've built your life on doesn't control me. It doesn't control anyone here. The manager sneered, stepping closer to Elon. His anger was palpable, his fists clenched by his sides. But he was too caught up in his own rage to see the truth of what Elon was saying. He had relied on fear for too long, believing it was a tool that could bend people to his will. But now, his hold on the cafe, his hold on the people, was slipping. You're nothing but a naive fool, the manager spat, his words venomous. You think you're some kind of hero because you're willing to confront me? But what do you know about power? What do you know about how this world works? Elon's eyes didn't leave the manager's, even as the man's anger flared. I know enough, he replied evenly. I know that power built on fear is fragile. And I know that it won't last. The manager's face twisted in rage, but for the first time, there was a hint of something else in his eyes. A flicker of doubt, buried beneath the anger. The realization that his control was no longer absolute was starting to sink in. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. The balance had shifted, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You think you can just tear everything down? The manager demanded, his voice rising. You think the world will just bend to your will because you stand there with your fancy words, pretending you know how it works? You don't understand the game. You don't understand the rules. Elon took a slow step forward, his expression still calm but resolute. I'm not playing your game, he said, his voice steady. You built your power on control and fear, but it's not real power. And I'm here to show everyone that it doesn't have to be like this. The manager's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, the anger in his gaze faltered. There was a moment of silence, as if he were trying to comprehend what Elon was saying. But the realization that his power was slipping, that his grip on the cafe was crumbling, only made his rage grow. You think you can just walk in here and rewrite the rules? He sneered. You think the rest of us will just follow you like sheep? You think any of this will matter when you're gone? You think this is a victory? Elon didn't back down, his eyes locked onto the manager's, refusing to let the man's words take hold. It's not about a victory. It's about showing people that they don't have to live in fear. It's about giving them the choice to stand up, to not let people like you dictate how they live. The words seemed to hit the manager harder than any physical blow could have. His fists trembled at his sides, and for the first time since he had entered the cafe, his bravado faltered. The truth of Elon's words, simple and unyielding, began to chip away at the carefully constructed walls the manager had built around himself. You don't get it? The manager growled, but there was an edge to his voice now, something more vulnerable. You think this is some kind of revolution? You think you can just change everything with a few speeches, a few words? This is real life. This isn't a fairy tale. Elon took another step closer, his voice still calm but filled with resolve. It's not a revolution, he said. It's a choice to stop being afraid, a choice to stop letting people like you control our lives. The manager's face flushed with rage, his teeth clenched so tightly it was almost audible. His fists were white-knuckled, trembling with the effort to keep himself from lashing out physically. But even as his anger flared, a small part of him knew the truth. He knew that the ground beneath him was shifting, that his influence was no longer as strong as it once had been. The people in this room, this cafe, weren't the same as they had been before. "You think they'll listen to you?" The manager sneered, his voice bitter. "You think you've won them over with a few words? You haven't. You're nothing. And you will never be more than that." Elon stood unwavering, his expression calm. "I'm not here for them to listen to me. I'm here for them to listen to themselves. To stop being afraid of people like you." The manager recoiled, his mind racing, the realization dawning on him that no matter how much he yelled, no matter how much he tried to assert his dominance, he was losing. His grip on the cafe, on the people around him, was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His power had been built on fear, but fear was no match for the truth Elon was speaking. And in that moment, as the manager's rage faltered and his confidence wavered, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't sure he was the one in control anymore. The silence after Elon's words hung thick in the air, the weight of what had just transpired reverberating through every corner of the room. The manager, his face flushed with anger and confusion, stood motionless, as if trying to will his old authority back into existence. But each passing second, as the weight of Elon's calm certainty pressed down on him, the more the manager's power seemed to slip away. Elon's stance was unyielding, calm but undeniably present. His words had struck a nerve, and now it was clear that the manager's attempts to regain control were not just futile. They were desperate. The man's fists were clenched, his teeth gritted, and his body trembled with barely contained rage. Yet the look in his eyes had changed. The defiance had been replaced by doubt, a crack in the mask that had once held his fragile empire together. "You think this is it, huh?" The manager finally spat, his voice hoarse with frustration. "You think you've won? You've just played into my hands. You're nothing but a pawn. This will never change. People like me, we always come back. We always find a way to take control. This isn't over." His voice cracked, not with strength but with vulnerability, as though he could feel his grip slipping away faster than he could hold onto it. The walls he had so carefully built around himself were crumbling, piece by piece, and all he had left was the hollow shell of his old arrogance. Elon stood there, unwavering. "You don't get it," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I'm not here to defeat you. I'm here to show you that the power you've been relying on doesn't belong to you. It never did." The manager took a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was starting to realize the truth that Elon was speaking, and the realization only deepened his fear. All the years of manipulation, all the times he had used fear to bend people to his will, were meaningless now. His power had been an illusion built on lies, on intimidation. And now that illusion was shattered. The room held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke, but there was a shift in the atmosphere, something that was almost tangible. The crowd had been silent, uncertain. But now, with Elon's words cutting through the tension like a blade, something in the air had changed. They had witnessed the unraveling of the manager's control, and the reality of that shift was finally sinking in. And then, just as the manager seemed ready to snap, ready to shout, to lash out, he faltered. His gaze flickered, shifting from Elon to the crowd, and for a brief moment, he seemed lost, unsure of himself. It was almost as if the world around him had shifted, and he couldn't find his place in it anymore. "You don't understand," the manager said, his voice quiet now, almost broken. "I'm not the one who's powerless. You are. All of you. You think this is the end, but you're wrong. You're all just as afraid as I am. You just don't know it yet." The words hit harder than any physical blow. The room shifted again, a collective gasp rising in the air. But it wasn't from the manager's threat. It was from the uncomfortable truth that had just been spoken. Elon had stood up. The woman had stood up. The others in the room had shifted. But fear was still there. It wasn't gone. The manager's accusation, his claim, stung in a way that no one expected. And then, as if the tension had become too much to bear, the door to the cafe opened again. But this time, it wasn't just a figure walking in. It was a force, one that had been simmering beneath the surface for far longer than anyone could have anticipated. A new figure entered the cafe. This time, not an enemy, but an ally and someone with power of their own. The door swung open with a force that silenced the room in an instant. A tall, imposing figure stepped inside, cloaked in authority, with a sharp, confident posture that demanded respect. The crowd turned in shock. It was the manager's superior, the very person he had feared, the one who held the power he had thought was beyond his reach. The man stood in the doorway, scanning the room with a look of cold calculation. He was the person who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, the one who had allowed the manager to feel invincible. "I was wondering when this would finally come to light," the superior said, his voice steady, laced with a cold venom that sent shivers down everyone's spine. His gaze fell on the manager, who looked like he had seen a ghost. The manager's eyes widened in shock. You were watching?" The superior's lips curled into a tight, thin smile. "I never left, my friend. I've been watching you this whole time, making sure you kept things in line. But you let it slip. You let your arrogance cloud your judgment. You thought you could control everything, but you failed." The room seemed to gasp collectively, as if the very air had been knocked out of them. The manager, once the figure of terror in the cafe, was now nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. His supposed power, the power that had made him feel untouchable, was only an extension of someone else's authority. The crowd's gaze shifted back and forth, from the manager to his superior, as if a curtain had been pulled back to reveal an even darker truth. The manager started, but his words were cut off by the cold, calculated voice of his superior. "Enough," the superior said sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You've embarrassed yourself. You've lost control, and now you're nothing. It's time to face the consequences of your actions." The manager looked like he was about to explode, his face a mix of humiliation and rage. But before he could speak again, the superior continued. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his voice low and threatening. "No one is irreplaceable. Not you, not him." His eyes flicked toward Elon, then back to the manager. "And certainly not the people you tried to control." The manager's face twisted in disbelief, his posture faltering as the weight of his failure settled into his bones. His superior stepped forward, an embodiment of control that was even colder than the manager had ever been. "You're done," the superior said bluntly, his words cutting through the air with surgical precision. "You're nothing now, and I'll make sure of it." And with that, the cafe, which had already been on the edge, suddenly exploded into chaos. The truth was no longer just about the manager. It was about the system that had allowed him to rise, to manipulate, to control. Now everything was in the open, and no one knew what would happen next. The tension had reached its peak, and in that moment, no one could say where it would go from here. But one thing was clear: the manager was no longer the only threat. There were far darker forces at play. The manager, once the personification of control, was now a shattered figure, exposed for what he truly was, nothing more than a cog in a much larger machine. The superior, who had walked into the room with an air of undeniable authority, was now the focus of everyone's attention, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The truth had come to light in a way no one had expected, and as the manager stood there, broken, humiliated, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger, the crowd began to stir. Elon, standing at the heart of the storm, had watched it all unfold. His expression remained calm, steady, but inside, he could feel the shift. The power dynamics had changed, but the real battle was only just beginning. It wasn't just about taking down one man. It was about the people in this room recognizing that they had the power to change their own fate. As the manager's superior spoke, the words seemed to echo through the cafe. "You think you're done here?" He sneered at the manager. "You're just a footnote in a bigger story. You never had the control you thought you did. And now you're nothing but a reminder of how easily people like you can fall." The manager's face contorted with rage, but he remained silent, the truth of the situation sinking in. His once unshakable confidence had been crushed by the weight of his own arrogance, and now, he was left with nothing but the ruins of what he had built. But even as the manager's fate seemed sealed, Elon knew the real lesson wasn't just in exposing the man. It was in the collective realization that they could never again be controlled by fear, by intimidation. They had seen the truth of their own strength, their own ability to resist, to stand up and demand something better. The cafe had been a microcosm of something much larger. It wasn't just a place where people came to get their coffee. It was a symbol of how power works, how it can be wielded and abused, and how it can be taken back. The manager had tried to control everyone around him with fear, using it as his weapon of choice. But fear was never the real power. The real power was in the choices people make. The choices to stand up, to resist, and to break free from the chains of oppression. "Remember this," Elon said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "This isn't just about one man. It's about the power we all have to decide how we live, how we treat each other. It's about refusing to let anyone, whether they're a manager, a boss, or a system, tell you what you're worth. The only thing that keeps you in chains is your own fear of what could happen if you stand up." The room was silent, every person processing the weight of what had just happened. The manager, once the tyrant, was now nothing but a shell, his power dissolved in the face of the truth. And yet, it wasn't just his fall that mattered. It was what came next. It was the decision every person in that room had to make. Elon stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "What you saw here today wasn't just a confrontation. It was a lesson. A lesson in how easily power can be abused, how quickly fear can control us, and how much strength we have when we choose to stand up to it." The manager's superior had watched the entire exchange, and now, as the last words of Elon's speech echoed in the cafe, the superior looked at the broken manager one last time. His face was unreadable, but his gaze seemed to say everything. There was no sympathy, no pity, only a cold acknowledgement that the game had changed. "Now get out of here," the superior said, his tone final, dismissive. "You're done. And don't think for a second that anyone here will ever fear you again." The manager, beaten and broken, turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The people in the cafe, once his subjects, now watched him leave with the same indifference one might show to a passing shadow. He was nothing now, a reminder of how fragile power built on fear truly was. As the door slammed behind him, the room seemed to breathe again. The weight that had settled over everyone began to lift, slowly but surely. They had witnessed something profound. The fall of a man who thought he could control them, and the rise of their own realization that they were no longer bound by his influence. Elon turned to the crowd, his gaze steady, his voice low but carrying the weight of a lesson that would echo long after they left the cafe. "The lesson here isn't just that we can defeat one person," he said. "The lesson is that we don't have to let fear control us. Not anymore. The power lies in our choices, in our ability to stand up, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And as long as we remember that, nothing can stop us." As the crowd slowly began to move, their faces filled with quiet reflection, Elon stepped outside, into the sunlight. The world had shifted, if only slightly, and he knew this was just the beginning. The battle for control over their own lives, their own futures had started here, but it would continue in every moment, in every decision they made from now on. And as the cafe returned to normal, the lesson was clear. Change wasn't something that came from a single action or a single person. It came from the collective will to be better, to fight for what was right, and to stand up in the face of fear. And in that, they had all found the true power, not in controlling others, but in choosing not to be controlled. The cafe was electric with tension. The manager, who had once towered over everyone in this space, now stood exposed and broken. His grandiose attitude had been shattered by the truth, and as he turned to leave, the final realization settled in. His reign of fear was over. The moment felt almost surreal. The people in the cafe had witnessed a pivotal shift, not just in the dynamics of their own lives, but in the very understanding of power. But the story wasn't just about the manager's fall. It was about something far deeper. It was about the choices each person had to make. Whether they were going to remain in the shadows of fear or step forward, unafraid, and take ownership of their lives. That was the real lesson here. Elon stood in the center of the room, watching the manager retreat. His expression was calm, his voice steady as he addressed the room once more. You've all seen what happens when fear controls us. Poisons everything. It makes us smaller than we are. But what you saw today wasn't just about taking down one person. It was about reclaiming control over our own lives. The room was still, every person processing the weight of Elon's words. But in the silence, something was different now. It was as if a collective breath had been released. The tension that had held them all captive had dissipated. They had witnessed a transformation not just in the manager but in themselves. They had seen what could happen when they chose to stand up to fear, and now they had the power to make that choice again. Let me ask you all something, Elon continued, looking around at the crowd. What if you stopped letting people like him control your lives? What if you made a decision right now to stop being afraid of what might happen and start choosing what will happen? The room shifted again. This time, there was no hesitation. People were thinking, reflecting, making decisions in their minds. The impact of what had just happened was beginning to settle in. You see, Elon said, stepping forward, this isn't just about one person. This is about all of us. Each and every one of you has the power to decide what your life looks like. You don't have to accept the fear, the manipulation, the systems that try to hold you down. The moment you realize that you have the ability to make your own choices is the moment everything changes. The crowd's energy had shifted. No longer were they sitting in silence, hoping for someone else to take control. They were standing in the shadow of a decision that had just been made, the decision to reclaim their autonomy, to take back the power that had been taken from them for far too long. As Elon stepped toward the door, the last remnants of tension in the room began to dissolve. The people in the cafe, still reeling from the events that had unfolded, were no longer passive observers. They were changed. The air was filled with the weight of an unspoken understanding. They had witnessed something rare, a breakdown of power, and the subsequent reclaiming of it by those who had once been silenced. Elon paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle, looking back at the crowd. The moment was almost surreal in its gravity. He knew the impact of this situation wouldn't be felt in full until later. But what mattered right now, what mattered in this very instant, was that each of them had seen it, had witnessed how quickly the illusion of power could fade, and how quickly they could stand up for themselves when given the courage. This wasn't just about standing up to one man. It was about seeing the truth. Power built on fear could only last so long before it fell apart under its own weight. And now that they had witnessed it fall, they had the chance to choose a new path, one of self-empowerment, self-respect, and self-determination. Remember this moment, Elon said, his voice steady, but it carried the weight of something far more profound. It's not just about what happens here, it's about what you take away from it, how you let it change you, how you decide to move forward from here. The room was still. People were processing what had happened, and more importantly, what was to come next. Elon knew that as they walked out of this cafe, they would walk into the world with a new sense of themselves. No longer would they simply accept things as they were. The truth had been revealed, and now they had to act on it. And now, as the scene settled, this message was meant for you, the viewer. Because this story is not just about the people in that cafe. It's about you. It's about every moment in your life when you feel small, when you feel like someone else is pulling the strings. You're watching this not just as a spectator, but as someone who can take this lesson and apply it to your own life. Think about the moments when you've been pushed down, when you've been made to feel less than you are, when you've allowed someone to make decisions for you, or when fear has dictated your choices. We all face these moments. Whether it's a toxic work environment, a controlling relationship, or simply societal pressures, we are constantly surrounded by forces trying to dictate how we live our lives. And it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that we have no control, that we have to live according to someone else's terms. But this story, this moment, is proof that you don't have to. When Elon stood up to the manager, he wasn't just confronting one man's abuse of power. He was confronting the system that allowed people like him to thrive. He was showing everyone that real power comes from choosing not to be controlled, choosing not to live in fear. And that's the lesson for you. You have the power to make the choice to stop letting fear dictate your life. Don't let anyone tell you that you're small. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't have the right to speak up, to stand up, to fight back. And don't wait for the right time to change. The right time is now. And that's the lesson for you, the viewer, sitting at home watching this unfold. What would you do if you stopped letting fear dictate your actions? This story isn't just a one-time occurrence. It's a reminder that in our everyday lives, we are all presented with moments where we can either choose to remain silent or choose to stand up for what is right. We can choose to remain in the shadows of fear, or we can step into the light of our own potential. If you're watching this and you've ever felt controlled, or if you've ever felt small, just remember, you have the power to change your story. Whether it's standing up at work, in relationships, or in your community, you can be the change. You can be the one to say, I'm not afraid anymore. That doesn't mean the road will be easy. The manager didn't go down without a fight. Fear doesn't disappear overnight. It takes time. But what matters is that you decide. You decide to no longer be controlled by others. You decide to step up for yourself, even when the path is uncertain. That is the true power, not in taking down someone else, but in taking control of your own future. As the people in the cafe began to stir, the weight of their newfound choices sinking in, Elon turned and stepped toward the door. The people here had seen it for themselves. They understood now that the true battle wasn't against one person, but against a system that tried to make them feel small. And they had won because they had chosen not to be afraid anymore. Now, as you watch this, take a moment and ask yourself, what choices are you making? Are you letting fear control you? Are you standing up for yourself when you need to? Are you stepping into your power and deciding the direction of your own life? Because at the end of the day, you hold the pen to your own story. Don't let anyone else write it for you. And remember, the fear you feel is not a reflection of your inability to succeed. It's just the reflection of a system that wants you to stay small. But you don't have to let it control you. You have the strength to make a choice today, and that choice will shape everything that comes after.